good morning to all of you, and a very good afternoon to all the people that are watching us from out of the Netherlands, because we don't only have people from Brazil joining us, but also people from the Netherlands for this new webinar at Dutcham. So very warm welcome to all of you. I even heard that people are listening to us from out of the car because they had to drive, but they didn't want to miss this debate. So really great to hear. Now, about the topic, I think that we all agree that currently we have a lot of negative news, unfortunately negative news, going around on Brazil. I think we can say that all eyes are currently on Brazil. Maybe it's because of the number of cases in Corona we have, but or of the way the Corona crisis has been managed these days in Brazil. But it could be also because of some economical situation that we have, or maybe most probably also for the political situation that we have. Maybe it's because of the active tweets of our president that we have so many eyes watching on Brazil now. Now, all of this, is it a view or is it a fact? Is it fake news or is it correct? Well, this is the debate that I'm going to have today with two specialists, and I'm very happy that I can introduce them to you. We have two Brazilian people living currently in one in the Netherlands, in Europe, and one in the States. And I'm happy that they are willing to join us for this debate, share their views on Brazil, not only the views, but also a few facts. So allow me to welcome, first of all, Daniela da Costa Bulthuis. Daniela, you're hiding somewhere, I think. And voilà, there is Daniela. Hi, good afternoon to you, right? Because you're in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Daniela, very warm welcome to this webinar. Daniela, for the audience, is, as I already said, Brazilian, living for many years already in the Netherlands, working currently for Robeco, one of the biggest investor groups in Europe, with the expertise on the emerging market, because you're the portfolio manager and the director of the emerging markets at Robeco. So great to have you, Daniela, in this debate. A warm welcome to you. Secondly, I'm happy to go to the other side of the globe, a bit closer to Brazil, also a Brazilian, Gustavo, Rangel. Welcome in our panel as well today. You're talking straight from the States, so I have to say good morning to you, right?
Hi, Peggy. Yes, that's right. Thanks,
okay.
And glad to be here again.
Okay, well, we already had you in a few panels before. For the people who don't know Gustavo yet, he's working for ING, as I said, based in the States, and he's the chief economist for the whole LATAM region. So a warm welcome to all of you. In the meantime, we have already quite a full virtual meeting room, so I think we can immediately kick off this debate. Now, as I said in the beginning, in the introduction, all the eyes are watching Brazil, right? And unfortunately, we see only bad news coming out of the entire world. Do you recognize this? Maybe a question to both of you. Do you recognize this, Daniela? Do you see that people are watching in a negative way to Brazil now from the Netherlands?
Well, Peggy, here are the views of caution, right? You have all the environmental news, the problems in the Amazon, and that came after the whole environmental crisis Brazil faced in 2019 with Brumadinho, the oil spill, the fires. So there is now a lot of attention in the Amazon team, especially after the investors initiative, which, by the way, Robeco is part of. Europeans in general, they worry that Brazil won't follow the Paris Agreement. Also, the dynamics of the COVID, they have been difficult in South America in general, right? Brazil is one of the most affected countries. And then, that's also creating some cautious view, because nobody knows how the country can recuperate from the current crisis and then have a nice recovery if the dynamics continue to escalate the way it is so far, right?
Yeah.
There was some mild improvement, but not that much. So those are two key short-term negative headwinds. And then I would add to that a little bit of a confusing external policy, which it doesn't help Brazil in negotiations. So, for instance, what we have now, the Dutch Parliament set reservations against closing the EU-Mercosur agreement because of the environmental, but also human rights concerns. So this is something that I think the country needs to work on how to communicate with external world, explaining what they have been doing.
Yeah, communication, key in this. But we go to you already touched a few points that we will go on later on, but for sure, I mean, I think the question initially was, do you feel that people in the Netherlands look at a negative way to Brazil now? Do you still dare to say that you're Brazilian in the Netherlands, Daniela?
Well, people are sorry for me when I say I'm Brazilian. They are like, oh my God, I'm so sorry for you. What's going on with your country? You must be devastated. That's that's how people approach this. So I'm like, yes. So it's complicated.
Yeah, we will try to convince people already, starting with the viewers that we have today, of the opposite side of this. So, Gustavo, do you feel the same thing in the States? Are you also afraid saying that you're a Brazilian? Do they feel
for sure. I mean, it's obvious in conversations with investors, just reading the press here, it's obvious that Brazil has a very serious image problem. Apart from the very concrete examples that Daniela mentioned, I think, this is a bit of there's a structural problem, so to speak, in the sense that this has been going on, apart from the events that you mentioned, it has been going on since Bolsonaro got elected. So in a way, I mean, Bolsonaro has been grouped with like this wave of strong men or authoritarian figures that have been elected all over the world, right? So from the international media point of view, you already have a negative point of view towards Bolsonaro's person. Not to say that he hasn't contributed to that, but you obviously have a negative goodwill already from this. I'm not saying that that's correct to say that Bolsonaro should be grouped with Turkey or Russia or Philippines or Hungary, but the reality is that the media does that. And I would say the other thing why Brazil is so frequently mentioned is its size, right? It's right now it's very widely covered everywhere. Every foreign media has presence in Brazil, and it's a very big country, and so that contributes to keep it in the headlines. And obviously, the negative news sell more. So there is those factors too, which in a way may reflect a bit of a bias.
Yeah, well, for sure, it's not a country. We say it's a continent so big. I mean, that makes it indeed already big in the perception of people as well. But for sure, I mean, the tweeting of our president here doesn't necessarily help us, right? In creating a positive image. But besides that, because indeed, I mean, we talk a lot about the president and the tweets he has and the communication that you mentioned, Danielle. It's a sensitive thing. But what do you really think that influenced the perception of the crowd outside? Is this really fundamentally on the perception again of the majority of people looking at Brazil? Do you think this is the key thing of the communication that is done, the way of communication that is done here in Brazil?
Well, I mean, we investors, we look into how the countries behaving internationally to see the rhetoric. And then the rhetoric the government uses very similar to Hungary, is very similar to the Trump administration, which is right-wing rhetoric that is against global standards, against global conventions, is very confrontational to the EU, also to the UN. So those are concerns, because most investors, they follow the PRI, the UN conventions. We have our EU directives in responsible investing. So, and then all the rhetoric has been used in a sense to criticize what has been done so far. So it's it creates a situation of antagonism. While what is interesting though is that, and then we are seeing now with this environmental situation, is that they use a very strong rhetoric to try to do it for their own public. But on the other hand, they know that they need investors. So yeah, they're willing to sit with us to talk.
Mm-hmm.
So
there is two communications to be managed, right? Internally and externally.
Yeah, so I think it's a communication strategy. It's a populist communication strategy. It follows some kind of standards, and yeah, it's a little bit copied from the US strategy, basically. But if investors can filter that, there are certain things and some advances that go towards a better investment environment in some cases. In other cases, not that much. So it just, yeah, it's not as easy because all the headlines are negative.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Do you see other things, Gustavo, from your side that might influence the perception besides what Daniela was saying?
No, I mean, I completely agree with Daniela. To a large extent, it reflects this clumsy, so to speak, attempt of Bolsonaro to emulate Trump. Perhaps, you know, this idea that he should speak to his natural constituency, but that is also advertised abroad. So it reaches a broader audience than it's required. But just like Daniela said, I think what often is missed here is how pragmatic the administration is when it comes to, reacting to the negative repercussions that these statements trigger. So we often see Bolsonaro taking back statements that he has said in the past when he realizes the negative implications, the negative economic implications that those statements triggered. So there is a lot of that I think needs to be taken into account. The fact that there are really checks and balances. Brazil's institutions are very strong. Bolsonaro is, after all, a president that has a relatively low popularity. 30% of the population supports him. So his power to really move Brazil towards his rhetoric, to really move institutions to adopt his rhetoric is quite limited. And that's really, I think, what's missing there.
Yeah, but here, because here we still talk about a lot of views that people have, which is based on a communication or a lack of communication or not a good communication. But if you talk about the facts and what may be straightforward question, Daniela, what is worrying the most? If you, as Brazilian, living for so many years outside but still monitoring Brazil as an investor, what is worrying you the most?
Well, yeah, certainly the environmental situation is worrisome. There is no coordination. I have slightly different view than Gustavo regarding institutions. I think we need to separate what are economic institutions like the central bank, which is really reliable, to institutions like the sector regulatory institutions, the ministries, and the executive branch, right? And things that worry us are attempts in the executive branch to impose certain social beliefs and then social concepts that affect institutional important organs. So, for instance, we are talking that in the environmental front, it was really worrying the situation in IBAMA, that they keep firing people, they don't replace. So, for instance, IBAMA is without a superintendent since April, and then they don't nominate anyone else. So, yeah, then all the scientists, when they come out with deforestation data, they are fired. It happened 2019, now it happened again, and now they are moving all the coordination to the vice president. This can be good, but why not using the institutional framework that's already in place, that used to be positive? I mean, the situation in the health and in the education ministries, which are two basic services. So that creates social unrest, it creates instability, and it creates long-term worries, because, I mean, they changed 3 or 4 times of health and education ministers. There is no plan. So those are things that we call sustainability measures that we worry about. So while we have a very strong economic team, then we should reflect, is the economic advances enough for us to turn a blind eye to what's being done in terms of the deterioration of certain institutions that support long-term development, in special sustainable development. And this is not to mention the federal police situation, right? Because that was even in a part chapter, the whole Lava Jato discussion now. I mean, corruption is a big problem in Brazil. It was being tackled, and then suddenly now it has all changed. So yeah, we don't know if there will be new evolutions or not. So those are things that are still on a gray zone for us.
Yeah. A lot of, if I ask the question, what do you have as concern? I see still a lot of things coming, but I pick out one in terms of the sustainability, because this is something you mentioned already a few times in our debate. Gustavo, from your point of view as chief economist, is this also something that you're looking at, the way that Brazil is treating or handling the whole sustainability aspect in the country?
Well, absolutely. And like I mentioned before, this has real economic impact, right? Like Daniela has said, that investors are demanding from Brazil commitment on environmental policy before they bring money into Brazil. And that is very positive. It's very positive because it is a very clear, practical example for the administration that these measures, they have real financial impact, and Brazil needs foreign investment. So it facilitates a lot, the conversation between the economic team and Congress, the conversation between the economic team and Bolsonaro. So these are super important elements that, in a way, is extremely positive, that is coming to the surface right now, and it's coming to the surface in a very practical manner, and that allows for a better conversation there, and stronger arguments from the economic team to push for these changes in policies that could otherwise not necessarily be economic in nature. So But like again, I said before, and I'll say it again, one thing that impresses me or makes me a little bit optimistic here is the fact that this is a very pragmatic administration. Like I said, Bolsonaro can easily change his mind, as we've seen time and time again, when he can be convinced that changing his mind will be positive for growth in Brazil. This is a very different set of circumstances than we used to have before in Brazil under Dilma Rousseff, who was very, very ideological, or like we see today in Mexico under López Obrador, also extremely ideological and very, very, very strong resistance to change their minds.
Yeah. By the way, I see a few questions popping in. I will pick them up because I see a few of them that already are answering the questions that I prepared, so I will pick them up along the way. Gustavo, but also something that was mentioned by Daniela, the whole complexity, complexity within the institutional governments. This is also something that has a negative impact. I mean, if I think, for example, at the whole Ministry of Finance, it looks like a solid backbone to me. I mean, this looks like quite reassuring to me, or do I see this wrong?
No, absolutely. This is actually something that sets Brazil apart from emerging markets in general, I think, is this high level of bureaucracy, certainly a central bank that is extremely credible, a central bank that is very ambitious. When you talk to congressmen, also you have strong leadership in both Congress houses, the lower house and the Senate. You have a Supreme Court that has played very crucial roles in recent years. So I think the maturity of these institutions, certainly specifically in terms of economic policy, is something that really sets Brazil apart. And the fact specifically that we have an administration that is very ambitious in pushing for this agenda. And by the way, this is not an agenda that's new. I would highlight especially that the previous president, Temer, was very, very successful in pushing for the implementation of very positive economic policy decisions that will continue to bear fruit in the future. But anyway, it's something that, like I said before, certainly sets Brazil apart.
Yeah, well, indeed, and I mean, then coming back to that, you know, what we always hear the negative sounds, but this is for sure, Daniela, also a positive thing. You already mentioned it as well, the whole economical stuff or the financial economical stuff. Paul Getz and his team, I think they're doing a fantastic job. This has not been so much communicated towards the outside world. This is not the message that the rest of the people get. Do you agree with that this is an asset of Brazil?
Well, I think it is. I think the economic team speaks enough to investors, and then there is no doubt the investors have confidence in the economic team, especially in the central bank. They are doing a fantastic job in terms of monetary policy and also financial deepening. The only main issue is when then the president goes to the market and says populistic statements. So yeah, those are points that investors still have concern, because he's the one that holds the pen. And then in the same way as the US, the president in Brazil has a lot of power to take executive measures. The only thing that I have less concern is to the fact that, as Gustavo said, the president has been very pragmatic when it comes to economic measures, while he's more vocal and more active when it comes to the social status, right? Because that's also where he holds his political base and also his supporters. So this create at least some buffer for Brazil if compared to, for instance, Mexico, but other nations as well.
I think another thing also, and then I come back to Gustavo, in order to mention the positive things, we discussed it before in a pre-discussion, the central bank governments. It's a strong point of Brazil as well compared to the other companies in LATAM. How do you see that?
Myself, right? Yeah, I mean, this is to me an enormously important point, especially right now, because right now governments everywhere are trying to devise policies to recover from COVID, right? We have a deep recession all over the world, and governments everywhere have to stimulate the economy somehow. And Brazil is perhaps unique in emerging markets in having been able to cut interest rates so deeply. There is no other emerging markets possibly that has been able to credibly cut interest rates as much as Brazil. So there is this very big stimulus in the pipeline that is coming from this structural break in interest rates in Brazil. Incredibly done. Essentially, Brazil has gone from having interest rate, Selic rate of 10% over the past 10 years on average to 2% possibly from now until the end of next year. So this is an enormous drop in interest rate. It has a side effect, which is the weakness of the currency in Brazil, but it's a very big stimulus. And the fact that this has been taking place amid dropping fully anchored inflation expectations, inflation targets that are scheduled to fall towards 3% in the next few years, which is like the norm across emerging markets. So this will continue to bear fruit, and it's a very powerful stimulus that I think makes me feel a bit more optimistic about the impact or Brazil's recovery post-COVID.
Yeah, compared to the other countries. Obviously, as you mentioned, indeed, the flip side of this is, and then I come back to Daniela, also a question that was popped up in our chat box. Yeah, the Brazilian reais, right? I mean, what can we say about that? The devaluation has been huge, massive. If you look even from March until now, I mean, as an investor, it must be very worrying, right?
Well, I mean, it has two sides, and the reason for that is because the Brazilian real was overvalued before that. Brazil is not competitive globally. It's a very closed economy, and the devalued currency is better for the economic growth. So I know that for the purchase power of domestic consumers, you lose some purchase power, but on the long term you gain competitiveness. And then what we saw is that this devaluation didn't translate into inflation. And that's a very important metric to measure. If we compare, and we invest in emerging markets, if we compare the Brazilian real in terms of valuation of the currency to other emerging currencies, it's not undervalued. The Mexican peso, for instance, is much more undervalued, has a much better carry trade than the Brazilian real. The interest rates are low, and with low interest rates, I think the Brazilian real will continue to remain at these levels. I don't foresee any further devaluation unless you have a fiscal crisis. I think it's the key factor to monitor, and that's what worries me the most at the moment, is to see how fiscal will model through. But at current stage, while you don't have translation of the valuation to inflation, I wouldn't worry that much on the devaluation of the currency. On the contrary, if Brazil can export more, it will be good for its industry, for its exports.
Exactly, and this is also a question that I see coming in from Danielle Curry, who is the CFO at Randstad, if I'm not wrong, saying indeed for Brazilian companies we are much cheaper than before. But again, Daniela, you believe that the currency as it is right now, on this value now, this is more or less his correct value?
I think it is. I think it's a fair value for the real because we have a very low interest rate at the moment. So you don't have any incentive to for foreign investors to invest in the carry trade like you have in other economies, like in Mexico, for instance. And you had an overvalued currency. Brazil needs competitiveness. As long as the devaluation of the currency doesn't translate into inflation, it's good to have a devalued currency to gain competitiveness.
Yeah, I see you agreeing, Gustavo.
Yeah, I mean, Daniela said it all. Very, very good answer.
Well,
and
obviously, for a lot of sorry to interrupt you. Obviously,
super positive development that and it's very important to realize that often people look at the currency level as a barometer of the health of the economy, but that's completely wrong. The health of the economy should not be conflated with the level of FX. Level of FX, to a large extent, has been driven by lower interest rates, which is itself a positive development. So you have a side effect, which is the currency weakness, which at the moment is not a problem because there is no inflation in Brazil, pretty much. And it will have the positive impact of long-term improvement in competitiveness of domestic producers. So it's a super positive development that is often portrayed as a negative.
Yeah, not for the moment. You said it correctly in terms of inflation. Well, we have to see what is happening in the coming months, obviously, because a lot of companies are producing here. They need some material from outside, and well, they have to buy. If you see the majority of our Dutch companies here, they buy quite a lot of products outside to be able to produce. Don't you see some danger over there, Gustavo?
Oh, there's going to be cost pressure there, but demand will be very weak as well, right? So the ability to pass on those cost pressures to consumers will be limited. But that is true. But those are also one-off events that may not necessarily translate into permanently high inflation. So the central bank can, in theory, overlook those if they happen. But it's generally a positive development that eventually may force or may incentivize corporates to produce domestically, or at least buy from domestic producers instead of buying from abroad. And obviously that would be positive.
Exactly. Staying into the positive news, I think there are a lot of opportunities as well within Brazil for foreign investment. We already mentioned it. Brazil needs the money from foreign investors. We don't need to be shy on that. But I think there are a lot of opportunities. Daniela, if you from an investor side, I mean, what kind of investment or what kind of things are possible here for foreign investors in Brazil?
Well, I think infrastructure is going to be the biggest opportunity, and then because in infrastructure there is still a big gap. There will be a lot of concession renewals coming through. There is this need to push ahead the competitiveness, and I think it could come via infrastructure investment. One of the things that is an interesting position is the fact that the government a nice regulatory framework for private investment. So, and that's something that also came from the Temer administration, but that has continued with this administration to have a positive regulatory framework. So we saw, for instance, the discussions on the sanitation law. Then they are trying also to look into a regulatory framework for the gas. This is obviously not something that will impact in the short term, but it's for long-term perspective. It's very interesting from the infrastructure development.
Mm-hmm. You see the same, Gustavo, or other things that you believe that are interesting opportunities for foreigners to invest here in Brazil?
Well, obviously, infrastructure is key. I think the effort by this administration to push for privatizations is another element here. And as we know, the Supreme Court of Brazil, in a landmark decision, allowed SOEs, state-owned enterprises, to sell subsidiaries without the approval of Congress. This is allowing Petrobras, potentially Banco do Brasil, Caixa Econômica, to sell subsidiaries without the approval of Congress. And that is obviously super positive and would attract plenty of foreign investors. It's always difficult for Brazil to approve privatization in general, because this is often, fiercely resisted by public sector workers. And so that was an easy way to, a relatively easy way to get around that difficulty. But it's very clear that privatization is no longer the taboo that it used to be. And this is all thanks to this administration. So that is another possibility for attracting investors in the future. A lot of what I see, though, is really small measures that have been introduced in Brazil that have long-term impact. They're relatively small in the sense that they don't trigger big headlines or it doesn't alter the perception, but they will have significant, impact in the future. From stuff that Temer approved, from like labor reform, outsourcing law, all the changes that took place inside BNDES, which the State Development Bank, that is now really, a bank that's much more focused in strategic development, in infrastructure, long-term financing, instead of taking the place of private sector banks. But anyway, I also once again want to mention this role that the central bank has been doing in terms of this credit revolution that we may see in the future. There's a lot going on in terms of regulatory changes, improving the competitiveness of the financial sector in Brazil, reducing fees, ambitious reforms to incentivize the creation of fintechs and improve or create financing instruments such as home equity loans, and improve the securitization of mortgages, things of that nature, or the cadastro positivo, which is the positive registry of to create U.S. style credit rating bureaus for individuals. Those are all relatively small, but the accumulated impact of this could be very significant. They don't show up in the very short term, but they will continue to bear fruit in the long term.
Yeah. Do you see that as well, Daniela, as an investor? Are you considering these positive elements as well when
we love
willing to invest?
fintech. We have the biggest fintech fund in Europe, and we have all the Brazilian fintechs. So fintech is definitely something that is a positive development. The central bank has been pushing for more competition. You have a concentration in the banking sector in Brazil. The banking sector in Brazil is very strong, but it needs to reduce a little bit the cost of credit. Cost of credit is still very high. So that's an opportunity. And I would also say that the new economy brought a lot of opportunity. There is innovation being done in the all online e-commerce in all this segment in Brazil. I mean, São Paulo is really an innovation hub in that sense. Brazil is a continental country, so there is a lot of things done to improve logistics, to mobility in general, right? So all that relates to the new economy is a great opportunity because you have such a huge consumer market.
Yeah, exactly. But by the way, speaking of the different regions, I pick out a question of Anton asking, technical one, maybe you can answer that, Daniela, if there is a difference in investment strategy in the different regions of the country. I mean, like Rio Grande do Sul, São Paulo, I mean, is there a different strategy depending on the regions?
Well, if you can segment per region, eventually you do that. For instance, when it comes to a privatization of utilities, then you look by region. Each region has a different dynamics. For instance, with all this Amazonian situation, you have some agribusiness companies that have exposure to Amazon, others don't. So you can differentiate there as well. So there are ways to differentiate. I mean, some companies that have more exposure to the Northeast, which has been more severely affected because it's a rather more fragile region, while São Paulo is really where things happen, right? So
Exactly.
having more exposure to São Paulo brings more resilience. So it depends on a company basis.
Yeah. Okay, I hope this was a question for a good answer for Anton. If not, Anton, let us know. I see another question coming up. The question is that our stock market is a great opportunity to invest since there are a lot of companies undervalued, which means that it's not consistent and permanent investment in the country. The money comes and goes quickly. In your view, do they intend to invest now on this short-term investment and on a long-term investment? It's a question of Daniel Curry again. I don't know who wants to pick this up.
Well, I mean, I cannot say from Robeco's viewpoint, but then I think it would be interesting to hear Gustavo as well. From our viewpoint, I think that the COVID in the short term limits a little bit the potential for Brazil. If you look at Brazil as an asset class, it's one of the most underperforming asset class. So I do agree on the assessment that there are investment opportunities, but you need to differentiate between what domestic investors can invest and what global investors can invest. For us, global investors, we are invested in Northern Asia because there, growth is coming back. You don't have COVID issues, so why take that risk? So those are things that play a role. That is something also we focus a lot on the investment opportunities, but that is a big risk to monitor in Brazil, and it's the level of indebtedness. Obviously, the low interest rate is helping Brazil. But Brazil is reaching 90% of gross debt to GDP in 2020. The fiscal gap will increase to minus 12% this year due to lack of revenues affected by the COVID crisis. So, and the government is talking about reducing taxes, right? So something doesn't add up there. Yeah. So that, to me, that's a key factor that prevents us to be more bullish, for instance, is the fiscal situation. We think that there are opportunities, but we're also looking with caution because the short term is still, there is a still ongoing crisis.
But I'm not a mega investor, Daniela, but I always learned that you should never look on the short term, but always on the long term. Gustavo, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there is the component which is external. factors, essentially what happens with the world and COVID in the world, the vaccine and so on, those would certainly lift everyone, including Brazil. So that is one element to take into account. But Brazil specific, I completely agree with Daniela that the developments regarding COVID, and specifically the developments regarding the recovery that we are seeing in Brazil. To what extent Brazil's recovery is outperforming or underperforming the recovery around the world. That is, I think, a key element here that perhaps I have a more positive assessment. I see Brazil's, when you look at Brazil compared to LATAM only, I'm not compared to Asia, like Daniela was saying. If I just look Brazil versus LATAM, we see a recovery in Brazil that is much closer to a V than the recovery seen everywhere in Latin America. And so maybe that will be eventually captured by investor sentiment and therefore trigger a rally or an outperformance in Brazil assets. But I also think that, like Daniela mentioned, fiscal account is something that we didn't discover too much here, but this is a huge challenge. This is a huge problem. And it's absolutely crucial that Congress comes forcefully in the defense of the fiscal spending ceiling. It's very important that any noise, we're going to have a lot of noise about the weakening of the spending ceiling, any kind of flexibilization of this spending ceiling, which is really the crucial element of the Brazilian fiscal long-term sustainability here. It's very important that Congress and the government comes very forcefully in the defense of the spending ceiling. Any effort to change that would trigger tremendous, volatility and weakening bias for Brazil. There's going to be a lot of increase in debt, in the debt levels for Brazil, but that's going to happen everywhere in the world. Absolutely. And if Brazil recovers a bit faster, maybe Brazil will come out of this a bit better. So that to me is the crucial element of this, the recovery. And we still don't have a lot of data that supports this, but we'll soon be having a lot more data. And I think that is the most important factor. And like I said, I'm a slightly more positive, but I'm comparing just Brazil with the rest of LATAM. What I see in the rest of LATAM is a recovery that's a lot more protracted, a return to work that is much more protracted than the return to work that we've seen in Brazil, even though cases are still rising everywhere in LATAM. But anyway, we'll see how it happens. There's a lot of uncertainty, but if Brazil does come out of this ahead, in terms of a quick recovery, there is a substantial, opportunity there, especially because prices have suffered quite a bit due to the negative sentiment. Exactly.
But the whole world is in the same situation, as you said correctly. I mean, spendings will go to the ceiling in most of the areas across the world, I think. Maybe also another thing that often has been said already, Brazil is a difficult country to do business when everything is complex. I mean, we said it right in previous webinars. It's not a country for beginners. I mean, you need to have a lot of motivation to come here and a lot of patience, because there is a huge bureaucracy here. Isn't that also a challenge of the government, Daniela and Gustavo, to make it much more easier to make it more, open and more easier to access for investors and for companies?
Well, the central bank is working on that agenda. It's a long-term agenda, but for instance, the central bank is coordinating now a revision of the bankruptcy law. That's key, because the bankruptcy law is really outdated, and it's a problem in terms of recovery of assets. also something that it's ongoing, still not perfect, but and that they need to work on is registry of properties, because it's difficult to have ownership registry. They are trying to update some registries, but yeah, it's still very difficult in general, and then there is a lot to be done there. I'm a little bit more skeptical because there are talks about property registry since I don't know 5 years ago, and nothing happened yet. On the bankruptcy law, I do expect something to happen even this year, perhaps, if we are lucky, otherwise beginning of next year. So that's a positive. Other things like more fast permits, as long as they respect environmental laws, I'm totally for it. So yeah, environmental and social laws, they need to be respected. That's but as long as they're respected, I think construction can move forward. I think there are some advances being made, and also the tax reform. I mean, if the tax reform, we need a little bit more coordination. It's a bit confusing what they're doing at the moment because they don't have a clear project, and then the Chamber of Deputies has one project, the Senate has another, and then the executive has a third project. They're going to have to merge everything. But the fact that they are finally discussing that, I hope at least something comes, because the tax structure in Brazil is ridiculous. It's very complex. They need to simplify that. My only concern is, and then I hope this concern is tackled, is that they do that in a way that they don't create a fiscal cliff. Because you need the simplification, but you also need to compensate some possible tax losses. So this needs to be well planned. So that's something we are following, but definitely if they pull this through, it's going to be a master positive for long term.
Yeah, will that happen, Gustavo?
I mean, it's very clear that the political momentum to approve a tax reform is extremely favorable. The momentum is there. There is widespread consensus that this is a huge problem for Brazil. Any corporate working in Brazil knows that it's just a nightmare to pay taxes in Brazil. So there's this huge momentum, political momentum, to simplify, rationalize Brazil's tax system. But like Daniela said, this is a very complex topic. It has a lot of winners and losers, and therefore you should expect to have a lot of noise surrounding the likelihood of its approval. But the most I can say is that the timing is right. The political focus is there. I think there's clearly a bunch of good ideas in Congress. It's about collating and agreeing on what's the best way to do this. But I feel confident that something will happen. I don't know if it's going to be the best thing possible or a lesser version of that, but something clearly I think it's going to happen. And apart from that, it's just, tackling this regulatory overreach that, is in terms of ease of doing business. That is something that, cutting red tape and simplifying regulatory needs for opening, closing businesses and things like that. These are all things that are relatively easily done. It can be done at the executive level, and it's something that there is a big focus on. So hopefully that will be, continued and have a significant impact.
Okay, well, cross fingers. I see another quite a pragmatic question coming up from Frank, who is asking, how do you view the political impact on the corona crisis and the availability of the corona vaccine organized by governments like here in São Paulo? Not sure if you have a vision on how they will manage the corona crisis here and the vaccines, but also how it will, how they will manage this in regards to the elections that are coming up in 2020. Not sure if you have a vision on that, Daniela.
Well, I think it's too early to talk about the vaccine. I mean, there are speculations, but the reality is that you had advances in a test. Obviously, as soon as they can, they should test the vaccine in Brazil. But in order to be effective, it's going to take more than 1 year. That's not something that you can count on short term. And then I hope the government doesn't count that as then a free pass to just liberate everything, because then it can become a negative dynamics again. Yeah. So I think it's a positive development, the fact that they are working so fast with a vaccine, but yeah, those things take time. And then we are seeing now in Europe here the discussions about it.
Well, we don't know when the vaccine will be there, I think, Frank, but indeed it will be not only when the vaccine will be there, but then also to look how they will manage it in Brazil, to put it into the market, and this will be probably also part of the recovery plan, whether it goes quickly or not. I have a look at some other questions here. I see also a lot of people putting into the chat box as well that definitely Brazil needs the investments, and that we also need to continue to grow on the development of the people. I see a lot of people commenting as well that we need to continue also working on the environmental issues, for sure. I mean, the whole world is looking at Brazil when it comes down on how to manage environmental issues here. For sure. I mean, I don't think we get this off the table. No, but I'm looking also at the time, and we have 2 minutes left, and I would like to use the 2 minutes to ask the last question to both of you. From a really personal point of view, how would you conclude what would be your final message to our audience in terms of how to look at Brazil? Very shortly, Daniela.
Well, I think Brazil has some opportunities to invest. Obviously, it needs to work on its weakening links. So there are some fragilities. But I think if you discount the risks domestically and then be cautious on that, there will be certainly a lot of good long-term prospects for the country. So we hope for the best, and that the government listens to investors on those international discussions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Gustavo, ending with a positive note from your side.
Well, I just, to me, I see especially comforting the fact that we have the finance ministry in very strong hands. And especially when I look at what's happening in the likes of Chile and Peru right now, obviously COVID is a tremendous challenge that has created opportunities for populism to trigger pretty disruptive initiatives everywhere. And we've seen that in Peru and Chile, which were previously extremely well managed, very well regarded countries or credits, and we're seeing that the threat that COVID has represented to those countries. And it's comforting to know that at least in Brazil we have Paulo Guedes there that will possibly help prevent the development of these types of measures, which in Brazil would be the weakening of the spending ceiling in particular. So that would be my view, and also, like I said, an opportunity for Brazil to take a faster path trajectory out of post-COVID.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think that one of the people of the audience said, how should we change the negative image for Brazil in the rest of the world? I think let's start already with ourselves. I mean, if we can contribute in a positive way of giving also the positive messages and all the opportunities that Brazil is offering to foreign investors, not only to foreign investors, but also to local companies here, Dutch organizations and companies that we have here, I think we are all already a very long end in helping Brazil to give the support that we need, because definitely, as somebody said from the audience as well, the rest of the world also needs Brazil in order to develop. So with this, I want to close the session. I would like to thank you once again, Daniela, Gustavo, for a very interesting participation, for a great contribution. It's always nice to have you among us in Dutcham. Thank you very much for being with us today.
And thank you, Peg, for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here as well.
Same for me.
And I also obviously would like to thank the audience. We have been a lot of people today listening to this conversation. I would like to thank all the people that listen here in Brazil and also the people in Netherlands who have been following us. Thank you very much for following us today. And don't forget that we have our social media. So please let us know if you like us, because we like that you like us. So feel free to post your comments and continue following us. And for the moment, keep safe and keep on putting a positive image on Brazil. Hope to see you very soon all. See you. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.